Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullough and I'm here at the James D. Julia Auction House taking a look at some of the machine guns that they're going to be selling in their upcoming fall of 2017 firearms auction. And specifically today, we're going to take a look at the MG-34. Now, more important than the 34 itself, perhaps, is understanding where it came from, because this was really one of the very first implementations of the concept of the universal machine gun. This is an idea that was circulated in the literature starting in the early 1930s, and I believe it actually originated with a Danish military officer. And the idea was to combine all of the different machine guns that were needed by a military force into one. This, hence universal. Now for the Germans, and this was dictated by the German military in 1932, they put out a request for a machine gun that would combine the roles of the light machine gun, which had been the MG-08-15, the heavy machine gun, which had been the MG-08, and then machine guns for use in armored vehicles, machine guns for anti-aircraft use, and machine guns for use in pillboxes or fortified emplacements. They wanted one universal gun that could be readily adapted to all of these different purposes. And they actually had a really interesting development program, or philosophy of a development program, to make this happen. There were elements of what became the MG-34 that came from a whole bunch of different developers. The Rheinmetall company was pretty heavily involved. They had a gun, elements of which went into the MG-34. The Mauser company had a lot of involvement. Mauser is often credited with this gun as a whole thing, but they were only part of the story. Vollmer was involved. The Simpson company plant, which became BSW and later Gustloff, they were involved. Ultimately, in order to negotiate the patent rights for the German government to create and manufacture this gun, they had to have an independent arbiter sit down. There were something like 18 different patents from these three major companies, Gustloff, Mauser, and Rheinmetall, and they had to negotiate the relative value of all of the patents that as they applied to the gun itself and come up with payment royalties for each company. That part was a gigantic bureaucratic mess. But it's really impressive that anyone even tried to do something like that. Normally with machine gun development, you would outsource to a single company, and that company would would use only their patents and design a gun that they thought best fit the government request. Well, in this case, the development was largely shepherded by the German Ordnance Department, Waffenamt Prüfwesen. They had actually Louis Stange, the Rheinmetall designer, who, by the way, had a bunch of other cool developments to his name, including the FG-42 later on. He was probably the primary engineer in putting all of these different elements together into the MG-34. Now, this was ultimately completed in 34. It was tested in 1935, and it was actually put into production in 1936. However, it didn't actually become formally announced as a German military small arm until 1939, at which point, by the way, they already had 50,000 of them, give or take. But this was actually considered a serious state secret up until 39. The original couple of editions of the manual were classified. They didn't let any foreign military attachés even see the guns. For one thing, they weren't really supposed to be doing this sort of machine gun development under the Versailles Treaty. And for another thing, this really was a pretty novel and impressive concept at the time. This took the idea of a light machine gun, a ZB-26, for example, and put it into a really truly universal role. So I should actually elaborate on that universal role a little bit. One of the requirements for the MG-34 was that it had to have both semi and full auto capability, which, okay, that's not a problem. And they also wanted an adjustable rate of fire. And the original MG-34s actually had a little clockwork rate reducer in the grip frame that could allow you to adjust the rate of fire from 400 up to 900 rounds per minute. And the reason for that was the different requirements for the different roles that this gun would be put into. So in an anti-aircraft role, they really wanted as high a rate of fire as possible. In fact, the 900 rounds a minute that the original early MG-34s could do, that wasn't high enough. They wanted more for shooting at airplanes because you have this very fleeting chance to hit a fast-moving target, and the more bullets you can fire at it, the better your chances of getting a hit. At the same time, 900 rounds a minute for a bipod mounted machine gun like this, an 8mm Mauser, would have significant control issues. You wanted a slower rate of fire for the gun when it was deployed as a light machine gun. Now, the light machine gun configuration is what we have here. In this setup, it has a pistol grip, it's easy to control, has a bipod. This weighs just over 26 pounds, about 12 kilos. The typical weight for a magazine-fed light machine gun was 10 to 12 kilos. So it's at the high end, but this is really in the weight area for a magazine-fed typical light machine gun, where it is belt-fed. So it was able to take the role of something like a Bren gun or a ZB-26 or a Châtel-Laroux or certainly a BAR. This thing could run circles around a BAR as a light machine gun in that role. It was controllable, it was portable by a single man. It would typically have probably been run by a two-man crew, one guy carrying ammo, helping with various tasks involved in the shooting, but one man could operate this by himself. In the heavy machine gun role, the same gun was fitted to a really complex and advanced tripod called a lafette mount. The advantage of this was it was what was called at the time a soft mount, where instead of simply being a solid tripod that you bolted a gun into and you made it very sturdy and you sandbagged it down and made sure it couldn't move, instead the idea of a soft mount, which by the way is also Danish in origin, the Madsen company was the first company to develop these. The idea there was the tripod is firmly fixed to the ground, but then the gun is actually in a spring-loaded recoiling cradle in the tripod. So when the gun fires, the whole gun, the recoil from the gun is absorbed by a mechanism in the tripod, which allows for much more accurate fire. In fact, with a gun like this, the gunner, when the gun was in a tripod, a lafette mount, didn't actually use the trigger directly. He used a separate trigger built into the tripod, which would then activate the trigger in the gun so that you weren't trying to hold on to the gun while it was cycling back and forth on this recoiling mount. The lafette mounts were sophisticated, they're ludicrously complicated, and disassembling them is an absolute nightmare, but they did their job really well, and they basically allowed a light machine gun to effectively turn into a heavy machine gun on this tripod. You're capable of sustained long-range firepower, and it worked really well in doing those jobs of both the light and the heavy machine guns. I should point out it does also have a quick change barrel. We'll take a look at that in a moment. The quick change mechanism is actually set up to be ideally used in the lafette mount. The need to change the barrel was a little bit less as a light machine gun unless you were shooting quite a lot. One other thing that I want to touch on is the number of these guns that actually existed. So I mentioned that 50,000 had been made by the beginning of 1939 when the gun was adopted. A lot of people have this conception that the MG-34 was like the standard German military machine gun through all of World War II, right from the beginning. Well, propaganda pictures are always going to show the guys with the nicest and best and newest equipment. And so during the early campaigns of the battle in Western Europe in World War II, most of the pictures the Germans deliberately took showed guys with MG-34s. However, when the war started in September of '39, the Germans had about 84,000 of these out of a total of 178,000 machine guns total in their inventory. So of the German-produced guns, they had, like I said, 84,000 of these, and then they had about 40 or 45,000 older German machine guns, a combination of MG-08s, 08-15s, and MG-13s. And these were all used extensively in the campaigns in Poland and France and the Low Countries. At that time, the Germans had also occupied Austria and Czechoslovakia, and they'd picked up a lot of guns there. They got, I think, 43,000 machine guns from Czechoslovakia, a lot of converted Schwarzlose heavy guns, as well as ZB-26 light machine guns. And they got another 7,000 or 8,000 guns from the Austrians, so MG-30s and another batch of Schwarzlose heavy machine guns. So early in the war, maybe 2 in 5 German machine guns were actually MG-34s. Now, they would continue to produce these very quickly. They were made by a whole bunch of different companies over the course of the war, and by March of 1941, they did successfully completely standardize on the MG-34. In that year, they issued orders for all of the non-standard guns to be sent back. Those guns were overhauled and refurbished at arsenals, and then made available for use in rear echelon, guys on the Atlantic Wall, places where they weren't expected to be in frontline combat. And the combat elements of the Army all had 34s. So let's take a closer look at exactly how this works and what made it such an effective universal machine gun. Now let's take a look at some of the various elements of the MG-34. There's a lot to go over here. This is, of course, I should say, 8x57mm, standard 8mm Mauser, and it is a belt-fed gun. Now, in the heavy machine gun roll on a Lafette mount, it would have a big long belt of ammunition. In the light machine gun roll, through most of the war, it operated with these, or through all of the war, actually. This is the Gert Trommel, and it is a little clamp-on device here. If I flip this handle over that way, it allows me to unlock and open this. This is a 50-round belt with a starter tab on it. And the way that this drum works is it simply, you load 50 rounds in the belt, and then you wind it up and set it inside this drum. The back plate here, by the way, is a little spring-loaded just to stop a little bit of rattling. And then this doesn't feed cartridges, really. This is just a container for a 50-round belt of ammunition. And that means you can have this clamped onto the gun, like so, while one man is carrying the gun. So it's not running around unloaded. This is the sort of thing that they did not have, for example, on the US 1919 A6 light machine gun. You had to carry a box of ammo separately and then load the gun when you got to your new position, or else run around with a loose belt of ammo hanging out of the gun. Those aren't good solutions. This is a good solution. Now, early on in its development, at the very beginning, they had a different design for the top cover, and they actually had a separate replaceable top cover that was able to use a double drum magazine. That proved to be a lot more trouble than it was worth. Those things are extremely rare and valuable now, but they were actually removed from service and replaced by this before the war actually started. So this is what you will see troops actually using. Those very early guns also had an adjustable rate of fire control here. That was fairly quickly dispensed of. It was also more trouble than it was really worth. And the standard wartime production grips are like this. They have this fairly distinctive 2-finger trigger, marked D at the bottom and E at the top. The bottom is a single fire trigger, semi-auto, and the top is a fully automatic trigger. So basically, if you pull the trigger without depressing this secondary lever, it will only fire semi-auto. This button at the top is a manual safety. I have the gun. The gun is not cocked, so the safety won't work. There we go. Now with the gun cocked, I can engage the safety, and that blocks the trigger. The safety disengaged, it will now fire. In order to access the working parts of the feed system, we have a top cover that we can lift up. One important safety note here, should you ever be using an MG-42, you never open the top cover without having the bolt locked back. If you have a stoppage while shooting, it is entirely possible to have opening the top cover release the bolt and chamber around and explode, and it can be a bad thing. So before you open it, lock the bolt open, and then we can lift the top cover up. We also then have a separate feed tray here. This is, you can just pull this out to have better access to the feed system should you need it. This is the late, or the standard, I suppose, production version. It feeds only from the left side. The very earliest iteration of the MG-34 actually had a reversible feed tray that could go either side, and that was an important aspect in it also being like a pillbox or a vehicle-mounted machine gun. You could switch the feed from side to side very easily. They realized that wasn't all that important, and they could simplify it a lot, and also add the 2 clamps here for the belt box. And so that was the standard production version through the war. Now, we've got our bolt in here. We will take this apart in a moment, but I can give you a nice little preview of how this works right now. what we have here is a recoil-operated gun with a rotating bolt. So when I'm going to drop this gently, when the bolt goes forward, it is going to rotate into battery right there, and then rotate back out of battery when the bolt cycles. So that's the basic locking mechanism. We have 4 locking lugs up here at the front. They're going to rotate into the barrel. The sights fold down when you're not using them. So in use, you would lift them up like that, but we can get a nice good look at them here. They're going to go out to 2,000 meters, which is actually not all that crazy for a heavy machine gun. You could certainly fire at a large area that far away. This is adjustable up and down, and it's just a rear notch sight there. Up at the muzzle end, we have the front sight, which also folds down. When I lift that up, it's usable. It is a barleycorn sight. The sight picture on these is basically the same as the K98K Mauser, which of course makes sense. We have a flash hider and muzzle booster at the front. That's integral to the recoil operation of the gun. And then of course there is a bipod attached at the front. There is this little thing hanging down from the bipod, and that actually allows you to make the legs narrower or wider to fit whatever sort of terrain you might be on. So I can thread that down, spread out the legs and drop the gun a bit, or I can do the opposite, thread it in this way, pull the legs together, and raise the gun up higher. One of the essential elements of the gun dictated by the German military was that it had to have a quick change barrel, and the barrel change mechanism is kind of unique on the MG-34. We want to have the bolt locked open, which it is, and then there is a latch right here on the side of, well, the back of the barrel shroud. And what I'm going to do is push that latch in, and then the whole receiver pivots down, down and around, and we then can slide the barrel right out of the gun. This, by the way, is part of the reason that the MG-34 continued to be used all the way through the end of World War II, even after it was basically replaced by the MG-42. The thing is, this system worked really well in armored vehicles in particular, where you didn't need very much extra space at all to just pivot the receiver around, basically around the axis of the barrel. And so you could mount these in tanks and still be able to change the barrels out. When they switched to the MG-42, that required some lateral movement or lateral space to pull the barrels out of the guns. And so a lot of vehicles and, well, mostly vehicle mounts, it was easier to just keep building MG-34s for them than redesign the interior of the vehicle to fit a different machine gun. Anyway, we can actually take this one step further because we have a button right here. This button comes down on the bottom of the receiver and lifts up, and that allows me to completely remove the receiver assembly. So if I push that in and then pull the whole receiver off. Now I have this easily transportable separate barrel shroud or barrel jacket, and I can take the bipod. By the way, the bipod folds up and locks onto this stud. These two openings on the bipod overlap, snap onto that, and hold it in place. I realized I forgot to mention this. This little bracket is the attachment for an anti-aircraft, like a spiderweb type sight. So you'll find that on the guns, but they usually didn't have anti-aircraft sights on them. This is again an element of this being a universal machine gun. In order to adapt it for anti-aircraft use, all you do is snap on the anti-aircraft sight and mount it onto any sort of anti-aircraft style of tripod, and the gun's good to go. I mentioned that this was a recoil-operated gun, and so at the front here we can take off the flash hider, and we will actually find a recoil booster inside. This helps push some of the gas pressure back against the face of the barrel here, which helps to cycle the gun. Now, before I take the rear end of the gun apart, I want to show you something. There's actually 2 disassembly latches down here. And if I just use this one, this simply removes the buttstock as a component. This is another element of it being a universal machine gun. You can see there's still a receiver end cap here. If you are mounting this in, well, in a pillbox probably, or definitely in an armored vehicle, you didn't need to have this sitting on the end of the gun taking up a little more space. So the buttstock went in a separate box with your bipod and an anti-aircraft sight if you had one, and the other components for turning it into a light machine gun, and it could be used in the tank just like this. Now, I want to take the whole rear assembly of the gun off for disassembly, so I'm going to use this latch, push that in and rotate it, and then this will jump off. There we go. There is a fair amount of tension in that recoil spring. So I can pull the recoil spring out. I can then use the bolt handle here to slide the bolt out the back, and then this same latch allows me to remove the charging handle. And then one last thing I can do is remove the grip assembly. This is held in place by two-part split pins here. And on this gun, they are really tight. So I'm going to tap them out with a punch. Once we have both sides of the pins out, then the grip assembly just lifts right off the receiver. But wait, we're not done yet. Let's open up the top cover. We can take the feed tray out as before, and then this is a spring-loaded button, which is going to allow me to remove the whole top cover assembly. All right, and finally, there we have the whole gun stripped apart. This may take a little bit of time, but it's actually a pretty darn simple process. And there's nothing really to go all that wrong in it. So once you understand how this works, it may take more than about 5 seconds, but you can do it pretty quickly, and you can certainly strip the gun down to all of its major service level components pretty easily. I am not going to go into detail on the trigger assembly here because these are kind of a mess. I do actually have a video that I did many years ago on specifically the MG-34 trigger assembly. So there will be a link at the very end of this video to that one. If you're interested, check out that video. We are going to look at exactly how this thing actually works, however. This is going to be a little bit hard to show you on camera, but the barrel is going to sit just slightly inside the receiver when the gun is all locked in place. And it is sitting like this with a plunger spring. This little guy is a really stiff spring because this is a recoil operated gun, which means every time it fires, the barrel is actually going to come back a few millimeters. And the reason for that is the bolt and barrel are going to remain locked together until the barrel recoils backward. That's what allows pressure to drop and for the whole thing to fire safely. So after that recoil of the barrel is pushing against this spring-loaded plug, and as soon as the firing cycle is basically done, this is going to push the barrel forward again, back into position to fire a second time. Now, we also have a pair of curved surfaces in here, and those are going to interact with the rollers on the bolt. But the surfaces in the receiver are kind of secondary. The important ones are these matching surfaces on the barrel itself. The MG-34 here is going to work kind of like the AR-15 in that the bolt is actually locking into the barrel like so. We have these locking lugs, 2 on this side and 2 on this side, and there are matching recesses in this barrel extension right here. So this is the unlocked position. The bolt's going to come in, and then these rollers are going to travel on this curved surface. The inside of the rollers are traveling on the curved surfaces on the inside of the receiver. That's going to force this to rotate. The bolt head is what's rotating. The rest of the bolt body back here does not. So the bolt body is actually being held in place by the receiver. The bolt head rotates, and once it's gotten to this point, it's all the way in battery, and then it's going to rotate just a little farther, and the firing pin is going to snap forward and fire a cartridge. Then this whole assembly recoils backward. The bolt is forced to rotate the other direction. That is going to recock the whole thing like this. This is a little tricky to show you without the receiver in place to actually control the movement of these parts. But once this thing is going to unlock like that, and then separate backward to eject the empty case and load a new one. I think the important point here is, or at least one of the important points, is to recognize that these rollers have nothing to do with for example, a roller locked gun. These are just roller bearings, kind of like the roller on the back of an M14 bolt. They serve to make sure that the whole assembly travels smoothly, and they actually don't have any any serious purpose in the locking. The locking is done by these lugs right here in front of the rollers. As I'm sure you're aware, the MG-34 was replaced by the MG-42 a little later on in World War II. And in case someone is going to ask why, one of the big answers is this receiver. This is a very complicated receiver. It's expensive, and perhaps more relevant for German interests at the time, this gun requires a lot of specialized steels. Strong alloys that require specific trace minerals that Germany didn't have a lot of native deposits of. That is why the Germans in general moved towards a lot of stamped small arms. Not only was the stamping process cheaper in bulk, it was more economical, but it also allowed them to use a lot of stamping steel, which is a very simple, inexpensive, and easy to acquire alloy. There are no fancy, weird materials. You didn't need extra nickel or tungsten or molybdenum or other trace metals in the steel alloys for stamping. So by switching to the MG-42, they were able to get away from this intricately machined and milled and expensive and also requiring really good steels type of part and get to just a much simpler stamped piece. So we will cover the MG-42 in more depth in a later video. Hopefully this video has given you a bit more insight into the MG-34 mechanically, and I think more importantly, some insight into the universal machine gun concept. This really was the very first of that type actually put into real substantial service, and the universal machine gun concept continues to be very relevant today. Some of the best machine guns that are still out there today follow this same premise, the Soviet PK or PKM being one of the fantastic examples. Set up for, it's a light machine gun, it's a heavy machine gun, it's a vehicle-mounted machine gun. It's kind of pretty good at everything. So it was the Germans acting on what appears to be Danish suggestion that first were able to actually put that into practice. If, having seen this, you decide that you really have to have an MG-34 in your own life, well, they are out there. They do show up for sale, and here's an example of one, in fact. So if you would like this one, take a look at the description text below. You'll find a link there to the Julia catalog page on this gun. You can take a look at their pictures, their description. It comes with a whole bunch of extra accessories that I don't have in this video, and you can see all of those as well. And you can come to Fairfield, Maine and participate live in the auction, or submit a bid over the phone or through the website. Thanks for watching.